schedule your questions. So our first speaker this evening is Dr. Victoria Rogers. Her research focuses primarily on natural ecosystems as she performs field research, lab experiments, and greenhouse studies about the impact of climate change and the spread of invasive species. Her current research includes identifying co-invasion dynamics and accessing changes in plant growth under altered climate scenarios at the Boston Area Climate Experiment. Please give Dr. Rogers a warm welcome.
All right. Thank you very, very much for having me. It's okay if I step to the side? No, I need to stay here. I'm used to walking around. Okay, I'll try to control myself. Thank you very, very much for inviting me and having me here. I'm excited to talk with you about some of what I do. I thought that I would start off and give you just a little bit of background about sort of what I do on a daily basis as a professor. Some of it may be kind of obvious, right, like the teaching part, but some of the other stuff that takes up significantly more and more of my life may not be. So I thought it might be of interest for you to know about sort of what I do. And then I'll dive into two research projects. One, if I run out of time, so definitely give me a heads up on time. But as Russ mentioned, I work on climate change impacts and invasive species. So I'll split those up and talk about what I'm doing for those. So I'm a professor of ecology at Babson College, which may seem a little strange. Those of you familiar with Babson College, it is in Wellesley, Massachusetts. It is a business college, right? So folks go there to study business. All of our students get a BS in business management, but they have to take science courses. And I myself am trained as a scientist. I went to the University of New Hampshire in biology and then went to BU in forest ecology and biogeochemistry. So that's sort of my area of expertise. Honestly, when I first showed up at Babson, I thought I'd be there for a year, right? I'll go in, I'd get some little bit more teaching experience, and I'd move on. But going there, I found this incredible niche that I think is really, really fun to be a part of, which is connecting science and business, which a lot of times often are on sort of polar opposite ends. And so me being the person that kind of bring those, educate business students about how much they need to know and understand STEM, I think is something that I've really, really grown to love. So Babson, as I mentioned, is in Wellesley. It's a small college. Another thing that I really enjoy, it's about a little over, although we're growing, over 2,000 undergraduate students. When I first started, so I've been at Babson now for 10 years. When I first started, we were, I think, closer to like 44% women. We're now over 50% women, which I think is fantastic. We have classroom sizes that are nice and small. Again, something that I really appreciate. I didn't have that as my own college experience. I sat in sort of the large lecture hall for a lot of my classes, but I teach now in really small classes where we do a lot of interactive exercises, walking around the classroom, sort of getting people up to the board. And the other really fun part about what I do is that because I'm teaching all non-majors, they're all one non-major, right? So I can tailor my course specifically for what might be of interest to them. And because I don't have to worry about them passing Bio 101 to go take Bio 102, I can sort of teach these really creative, fun courses that I create. So there's a lot of benefits, obviously some drawbacks too. I don't really get to teach science students. I have a couple that sort of transition from business to wanting to do some science. But that's sort of Babson. And my responsibilities as a faculty member there are certainly teaching, right? And that's supposed to be about 50 to 60% of my time. Oftentimes during the semester, that'll shift, and it's a lot more of my time. Right now, we just finished, we had finals. My grades were due on Monday, so I'm done with grading and classes. And I switched then over to another big part of my life at Babson, which is research. So I'm required to do significant amounts of research for publication and for tenure process. So about 20 to 30%, but like I said, that kind of shifts during seasons. I do a lot of outdoor work, so that kind of works well for me. And then the other part is service, which I'll mention in a minute. So courses that I teach, I mentioned, I teach some kind of, maybe strange, different, hopefully exciting kinds of courses to my business students. They're required to take 2 science courses. I haven't taught a foundation science course in a while, but I teach a lot of the intermediate courses. So that would be the second course that they would take, oftentimes for many of them, the last science course they'll ever take. Which for me I take as like a personal burden, like something that I want to make sure that they leave really enjoying or knowing why science matters, right? Because a lot come in kicking and screaming. They don't want to take these courses necessarily. Maybe they didn't have as great of an experience as you guys did in high school with science. So they tend to, not all, but they tend to not be really super enthusiastic about science. So I see it as my job to really get them to see how important it is. So I do that with teaching this ecosystem management course, which is a lot of fun. It's kind of like an applied ecology course for business students. And then I teach a whole bunch of different types of electives that students can then choose to take. So I've taught economic botany, a global climate change course. A few years back, I got to take students to Costa Rica to teach an ecotourism course, which was a lot of fun. And I teach an urban ecology course, a biomimicry course, which is something I've gotten super interested in lately. I'm happy to talk with you if it's something that you're interested in as well later on. I see it's like kind of the perfect place where I connect with business, right, to be able to learn from nature how to do things better. And I've also been teaching, we just finished this really fun co-taught course with art and science, so kind of getting to that STEAM, right, instead of STEM. Aspect where I work with an artist and we teach this art and ecology and Anthropocene course, which has been fantastic. It's been really big learning experience for me as well. So the less glamorous part of my job is the service realm for sure. Some of it is kind of, sort of the obvious maybe, right? I have to serve on some committees. I advise honor students. We do have some honor students that do anything sort of around sustainability I get sort of roped into. So I do advise some honor students, lead a bunch of curricular and co-curricular initiatives, mentoring other faculty. I feel weird now, but I'm one of the older faculty in our science group, so trying to make sure that other faculty can come in and get linked up with good resources. And then the other piece that's really important is the professional service. And so this is where I see as sort of contributing to the scientific community, right? So I do a lot of reviewing of manuscripts, so the peer review process is incredibly important. Scientists submit, like I do too, submit a manuscript. It needs to get peer reviewed by other scientists. That process is why science is so amazing and works so well, right? So I do a lot of that, serving on grant panels to review like NSF grants, to give money, to decide where funding goes. I attend and present at conferences. These are some of the major conferences that I typically go to, and serve on some boards and professional societies and things like that. So the bulk of what I wanted to talk with you guys about was sort of my research. And my primary research, I kind of have these three different areas. For my PhD, and then sort of soon after, I did a lot of work focusing on invasive plant species. And then starting at Babson, I had this sort of incredible opportunity to work at the Boston Area Climate Experiment, which I'll show you in just a minute. And sort of that kind of helped me shift over to doing a lot of work with the ecological impacts of climate change. So that's something I've focused on more recently, and actually I'm starting to now sort of pull these two together, which has been really fun, thinking about sort of how climate change impacts or helps the spread of invasive species. And I'll mention just briefly the other piece of my research, which I had zero actual training in as a graduate student, is pedagogy. And so this is something that at Babson they encourage folks to do this a lot. It's trying to actually collect data from how you're teaching your students to be a more effective teacher. And so I've done some of this. It's really interesting. So doing sort of some before and after you teach a concept, or sort of curriculum development, stuff that other people can use out there. So I've grown that sort of area of my research. It's not my primary research, but I think it's kind of interesting. And I've worked with this group called the Ecological Researchers Education Network that I helped sort of start up. That is a big group. I think we've got about 300 colleges now that are a part of this. And it's perfect for me, right? I'm like the only ecologist at Babson, so it's really hard I can collaborate with lots of different people in other areas, but to collaborate with another ecologist, I don't really have anyone. And so this is a group of people that all sort of fit into that network. And so we work together, we create these protocols that we have our students go through and collect data. And if everybody does this all across the United States, collects the same sort of data, we can get some really powerful and publishable results. So that's been a lot of fun to be a part of too. Okay, so I'll dive into the first project. Do you have time, or do you want to just let me know when? I'm not keeping track of time, but I don't want to let me know. So the first project, like I mentioned, is looking at climate change impacts. So as I'm sure everybody is aware, we're drastically increasing our average surface temperature. Huge shifts are expected. These are dependent upon different climate change model scenarios. But these are, again, sort of business as usual or sort of high scenario stakes. And also precipitation as well, right? So one of the potentially more concerning things is that we're changing how and where rainfall occurs. And predictions for the Northeast. Here you can see, this is from a few years ago, but looking at what will happen with short periods of droughts. This was previously, and then what's predicted for the future at the bottom, right? Short periods of droughts, medium droughts, and then longer droughts, periods of over 6 months of drought. And you can see sort of the projections that will happen for increasing that here in the Northeast. And that's incredibly devastating for plant life, right? Really, really concerning for thinking about food production. There's a whole lot of concerns. So overall in the Northeast, it is predicted that rainfall will increase by about 10 to 15%, but that increase is going to come in the winter. Right, so we're going to get a lot more big dumps of snow, and actually we'll have probably less rainfall in the summer. So scenarios for Massachusetts for what they've been sort of predicting is, I like this sort of image, because you just pick up Massachusetts and you see where we fall, right, and which year under a high emission scenario or a lower emission scenario. The worst case scenario is we're looking at climate sort of like South Carolina. By before 2100. So what does that mean for forests, right? My main interest is looking at sort of natural ecosystems and how they're affected. There's predictions that we could have huge shifts in the species that could actually exist in these types of scenarios. So that will affect forest management, forestry practices, and forest health, right? So you can see here predictions are that we would shift from sort of a grouping of different types of forests into one that is predominantly oak hickory. So a lot of experiments that try to look and predict and see what will happen with this tend to use sort of 2 time points or 2 scenarios, right? Going out there measuring a high and a control. And this can be problematic because a lot of times we don't have these nice linear responses, which we're making assumptions about, right? So this is various ecosystem responses here across the Y, temperature or soil moisture gradient across the X. And oftentimes we don't get these simple linear responses, right? We can end up, when it comes to ecosystem processes, something like this, something like this, something like this, right? And so we've designed the Boston area climate experiment to test just that, right? Instead of just control and heated, let's look at a whole wide variety in between. So this is a multi-factor, multi-level effect experiment. And I'm certainly not the only one working here. There's a whole group of folks. This was started by Jeff Dukes with a large NSF and Department of Energy grant. So the way that the experiment is set up, this is in Waltham, Massachusetts, if anyone's ever driven by near Bentley College, right on Beaver Street. It looks like kind of these skeletons of greenhouses that's out there. So there's 3 of them. And we've got 4 different temperature treatments, right? So we have a control, our ambient. We have a low, medium, and high, where we're warming using these infrared heaters across on each plot. And then 3 precipitation treatments. We've got an ambient, a wet, where we're actually collecting the rainfall from the drought using these polycarbonate slats here that are covering half the surface area that's coming through. And you can see maybe this white pole here. That's where the water all sort of drains into in the gutters, and then it goes over to a sprinkler system. It's collected in these big tubes, and kind of like at the grocery store, right, where it sprinkles your vegetables as you walk by to pick them out, right? This is exactly what we have over on the addition side. So we've got these different setups here. And when you look at them, they're sort of nested together. You can get an idea of our 36 different plots. We've got 12 different climates, right, each replicated 3 times. And we measure a whole bunch of different things through here. There's folks that look at soils and microbes, and I've done some work looking at some herbaceous stuff. But the thing I wanted to mention to you that I've published most recently is about tree species. So we went in and we planted these 6 different species of trees as seedlings. They were 2-year-old seedlings that we purchased, sort of bare root, planted them in. Into our plots. This is our plot with our heater on it. We've got 4 sort of subplots within them. So that gives us 4 replicates of our 36 plots. So this is planting 864 tree seedlings, mammoth undertaking. And these are some of the undergrads and other folks that helped in doing all of this. And we took measurements over a couple of years looking at survival of these tree seedlings in these different climate scenarios, and also leaf production and leaf chemistry. And one of the things here, this is total leaf area, and the warming treatment by the precipitation treatment for the 6 different species. Sort of overall, what you can kind of see here is that warm and dry conditions for these suppressed leaf production of all of these species, right? So we're looking for the future to see a reduction in ability for these tree seedlings to produce leaves. The most affected species, right, who are going to be the winners versus losers in their future climate scenario, the most affected were sweet birch and American elm. So it looks like those are 2 species that are going to be hardest hit. Interestingly, drought had a larger negative effect than the warming did. So we tend to hear, a lot about global warming and focus on the warming part, and actually it's the drought piece that at least is going to affect these species more. And looking at survival, we had big-toothed aspen actually was the only one that was significantly affected for its survival. So it died off very, very quickly in high heat scenarios and in dry conditions. So for the future, looking like we're not going to have many of those around. Thinking about incorporating this into climate models is something that we're looking at next, right? Trying to understand, as we make these projections for climate models, understanding the feedback effects that happen with, well, if these species are all gone, or if we have big die-off of tree seedlings, then we're producing even more CO2 into the atmosphere. All right, that was kind of quick, but that was the first experiment. Do I have time to go through the next? Yeah. Okay, great. So the other piece that I work on is invasive species. And these, how many folks know what invasive species are? Yes, everybody? So they're non-native species that come into an ecosystem, and they cause either economic harm, environmental harm, or harm to human health. Oftentimes, if they're really nasty, they do all 3. And this is actually defined by law in the United States, and we have a whole bunch of these, right? They come in and they completely disrupt the ecosystem. It's currently thought of as being one of the most pressing global threats. There's questions as to whether it is actually the #1 cause for species extinction right now. Oftentimes it's thought of as habitat loss, but they kind of go hand in hand. And there were estimates of cost to control invasive species back quite a few years now, back in 2005. But at that point, it was $120 billion every year that's being spent on just trying to control these. A lot of this is in agricultural fields, but the cost is tremendous. And you can see these are just a few of some of my favorite examples. I don't know if anyone's familiar with them, but kudzu. Kudzu is the vine that ate the South, right? It came in, we planted it all over the place. Farmers were encouraged to, and this was a forest, right? It's completely grown over the trees. It suffocates them. If you leave your car parked there for too long, it grows right over your car. So it's a huge problem in the South. Zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. Tiny, tiny, tiny little zebra mussels that they stick on in pipes or on organisms. They're bioaccumulators of pollution. They cause tremendous problems. Anyone ever had the unfortunate experience of fire ants? Hopefully not, you have. Whereabouts?
Costa Rica.
Okay, yeah. So they were from Argentina, I believe, and they're in a number of different places, but they were brought in accidentally to Alabama in a shipment of lumber, and they just escaped. And they hurt, right? They hurt. They bite. They're called fire ants for a reason. They can produce mounds like this big. Small children can walk into it. It's really dangerous, horrible stuff. And if you don't like snakes, Guam may not be the next vacation spot for you. The brown tree snake has completely taken over the island. This was brought in, again, accidentally from the Philippines. And they've consumed most of the native birds on the island. They've started eating people's cats now, and they're like dripping from trees. So that's a warning for you for Guam. So these invasive species, oftentimes scientists go out there and they just study their one species, and that's what I've done in the past. You find out how that one species changes the environment, what it does. But most of the places that are invaded by lots of different species, right? These areas, the side of the road or the patch that's moving into the forest has many, many invasives in it. So I'm really interested in these sort of co-dominant invaders and how they're interacting, right? So how these, whether it's sort of a 1 + 1 is more than 2 effect. So that's what I'm looking at now with garlic mustard, which is a common plant around here. I bet you if we scoured around for long enough, we could probably find some out there. This was introduced on purpose back in the 1860s, from Eurasia. And you can tell it because it has this garlicky smell if you rub the leaves. And it's taken over forests. It produces these cyanide compounds that actually kill off the fungi in soil that can affect tree seedlings. So I'm interested in garlic mustard. I'm also really interested because in New England, this is one of our most threatening invasives, oriental bittersweet. So this stuff here, Celastris, is a vine. It's a woody vine that actually winds up trees. You'll see it around, if you leave some patch of land for long enough, it winds up and it can pull trees down, right? So it is incredibly devastating. It has these pretty red berries that have sort of orange on the outside, and people think it's very pretty, and so they make wreaths out of it and they stick it on their door, and then the berries fall down and seeds start growing, and it breaks up your porch as it sort of grows up through. So be careful. So I'm really interested to see if these two species have sort of synergistic effects, and if they are planted together, again, with tree seedlings, whether they will reduce the survival or the growth of tree seedlings more than they would if they were alone. So I've been working with a colleague from Simmons College with a site up in North Sutton, New Hampshire, where we have a forest gap, sort of a clearing here, where we've set up these 16 plots. They're 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters. And we've dug in a large fence around the outside to keep out herbivores. That's one of the really tricky things about ecology, is studying and doing experiments in ecology, is nature always gets in the way, right? It always, like you have at our Boston area climate experiment, the first year, bunnies came in and ate everything, like everything. And so we had no data. So had to start again, build the fence bigger, right, stronger. So we always have to keep that in mind. And here we've gone through and we planted in 6 sugar maples per plot. So again, we purchased these. They're 2-year-old sugar maple seedlings. We're particularly interested in them because they're being hard hit now anyway by climate change. They're sort of a signature species for New England, right? Everybody loves sugar, loves maple syrup, and a lot of that is moving, production of that's moving northward to Canada. So we're looking at them. They're planted in here, and then we set up sort of our treatments. So we have our 6 sugar maples in each of these plots, and then we have our control. We have one that's invaded by oriental bittersweet, one that's invaded by garlic mustard, and then one that's co-invaded. I just went out to the field yesterday and started taking some measurements, and stuff is starting to grow up. So it'll be really interesting. The seedlings have been there for a year. The sugar maples will be interesting to see sort of how they start being affected. So we'll go through and we'll take measurements of survival, height and diameter of the trees, the number of leaves that they produce, right? A lot of this is bending over, like measuring small little things. Leaf chlorophyll content, leaf chemistry, so we take a lot of samples, bring them back to the lab, analyze them for things like carbon and nitrogen. And then we'll take measurements of the invasive plants, how many of them survive, how productive they are when they grow with each other, and then a whole suite of environmental measurements. So we do a lot of sort of soil sampling, take big cores, go out there and core the soil, pull out soil cores, and analyze it as well to see if it's being affected. So with that, I will stop and wait for questions or take questions.
We'll do questions at the end.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.